Welcome back to the podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about Green Lantern Rebirth that Johns did a while back. And I have Tom Marvelli. He's been on the show several times. He's got a campaign going at the same time. So, first off, Tom, tell the fans a little bit about yourself.
Hi. So yes, I'm the Tom Marvelli, the publisher, creator, writer of Another Door Comics. And prior to starting my own indie comic publishing line, I was a creative executive at Marvel for almost 20 years, and as well as a creative director for Hasbro. Shortly after leaving Hasbro, we had started Another Door Comics, where we are now selling all of our books through different Kickstarter campaigns. And we are currently on our fourth campaign, which is A Signal from Space, which will be pre-launching at the beginning of February.
So, prior to this, you had to actually do a little bit of research with Green Lantern Rebirth because you weren't familiar with that project. What did you think about it?
Sure, I thought it was great. I think with Jeff, specifically Jeff Johns, I think he had a really amazing challenge ahead of him. And I think he did a really good job of trying to thread the needle in terms of retrofitting, retro engineering, taking all this backstory of Hal Jordan and all the things that character had gone through in the decade prior, and really just trying to move the character forward while retrofitting and re-engineering all of that old story, all those different storylines so that it made sense. The beginning of the turn, if you will, of Hal Jordan was when Coast City was blown up during the death of Superman. And we saw this hero sort of Greek tragedy descent from being this ultra hero to being this mega villain. Did a great job in trying to create like the rhyme or reason why he turned into a villain that, but the way that he was able to retrofit that storyline and create the other villain and so forth, I think really helped move that story forward. And again, I thought he did a great job in moving the character forward while threading the needle on retrofitting.
Back in the 90s, DC has some really cool stuff going on, but it was also some weird times going on because they killed off Superman. They sidelined Batman. They did this to Green Lantern. I think there was a
Mhm.
time even where Wonder Woman was no longer Wonder Woman.
Right.
And you replaced Green Lantern with Kyle Radner, and that became the next Green Lantern for X number of years. And you took this great hero, and you're right, it was kind of like a tragedy where he became a villain. And you're
Right.
right, you got to give credit for John for retconning and fixing things to make it
Right.
look good instead of just poof,
Right.
whatever. It had been like 10 years since we actually saw a Green Lantern, Hal Jordan, in something. You're like, oh, this is interesting. Oh, he actually pulled it off. It was a miniseries, I believe it was 6 issues. Are you a fan of the artist Ethan Van
Yeah, I mean,
Sciver?
yeah, obviously during my time at Marvel, he had worked on a couple of the new X-Men and stuff during that time period. So I was more familiar with him there than looking back at his Green Lantern. He's an incredible artist. I can understand why Jeff Johns wanted to bring him onto that story because he is really an incredible artist for sure. And yeah, go back to like you were saying, like with the story, there was really the redemption arc of that character was very unique the way that Jeff did it. It's like because when he became Parallax, that was when he became the Ultra Villain, and then so we never really saw like a true redemption arc for the character other than when he was with the Spectre and doing some of that stuff. But I think Jeff, the way he handled it was really good in how he took the character who really did such evil things and gave a rhyme or reason for it. And so made him a hero again without the baggage of he's the reason why these people died. It's like there was another power pulling the strings, which then took him basically took Hal Jordan off the hook for all the bad things that occurred. And I just thought that was a very smart way to handle that because it would have taken a very long time. And to your point about Kyle Rayner being that when you think back to the Flash with Barry Allen, then it becomes Wally West. There's a generation of kids that Kyle Rayner is their Green Lantern. I heard that they're bringing him back into some recent stuff. They're bringing him back into the fold a little bit. But again, I just thought it was a very good story. Just like I loved the death of Superman to the return of Superman. I love the story of his fall from grace to ultimately what became his, I don't want to call it redemption, but basically him becoming a hero again. I just thought that from a character story arc, those are really strong character story arcs.
And you got to give John's creative credit for finding the workarounds to make this naughty thing work.
Absolutely. And that's why you talk about bringing in the JLA. I think bringing in Batman as a counter argument to the character, like he's the most weary of Hal Jordan and his return, whereas someone like Superman is going to find hope and take the half full approach to all of that stuff. Batman is a little bit more cynical in his nature. So he's the one who's not as trusting of Hal Jordan. The whole thing with fear, Batman is based on fear, and Hal Jordan doesn't fear him. So he becomes like that sort of 180 to Hal Jordan. But again, I just like the way that Jeff wrote that because it really did become the voice of hey to the audience of hey, this character hasn't earned a redemption, like he is off the hook now. And I think he gave Batman the great voice for that part of the audience who would have that opinion.
The other thing I liked, and correct me if I'm wrong, but even if you're not a Hal Jordan fan, you know very little about Green Lantern, you could
Mhm.
go into the series cold and get a really good comic out of it.
Yep, 100%. Again, it has a really good beginning, middle, and end in terms of that from a storyline standpoint. And then you go down the rest of the stuff that Jeff did. I know I'm not talking about that here specifically, but like the Secret Origins run that he did that kind of really helped frame that up. And you really didn't have to read another single thing prior to that Secret Origin. You got everything you wanted in that. And again, you got this big blockbuster story in the Rebirth. And it was like the Rebirth storyline was necessary to move that character forward to clean the past off of him, dust him off a little bit, and move him forward. And I thought he did a great job in threading all of those, the complexity of that, because you have over a decade at that point of the character doing very bad things. And yeah, DC seemed to get lost in what to do with this character after they had those big villain moments. And so now what do we do with this character? And obviously they created the whole Spectre thing, which then gave him another sort of plot thread. But really, Jeff coming in, dusting, sweeping all of that away in a very clean and organized way. And I thought, like I said, and now to where the character is today. And I think people respect the character even more now. And I think that there's a fan base that, because of that storyline, that is still following that character today because of what he did in Rebirth.
Yeah, because Rebirth, that set up a whole bunch of new mythos in the whole Green, because he went on and did a whole string of
Yeah, that's
Green
right.
Lanterns. He really was on caffeine high because he spent the next few years because he
That's
loved the
right.
Green Lantern course. He did things with the Guardians. You had Blackest Night come out of
Yeah,
it and saw new characters like Sinestro in a different light than what he did before.
right.
And he had this huge arc that still stands up today.
100%. Yeah.
And it'd be funny because if Rebirth didn't go over with fans, you would have had the rebirth of Barry Allen a few years later, which is
Right.
even harder sell because they just stone cold killed him
Right.
for 20 years, and now you bring him back, and again, 20-year people. My Flash is Wally West. For my Flash, I'm a
Right.
baby boomer. Is always Barry Allen. So I'm like, when he during the crisis when he got killed off, I'm like, what'd you do to my Barry Allen?
Right.
And they brought him, and even forward 10 years now, that all plays into the rebirth initiative that DC did, which
Mhm.
was embracing their past because they realized that the new 52 just wasn't doing
Right.
it because they threw so much of the mythos out. And we were talking about this off camera that DC is best when it embraces all their quirkiness and accepts everything there is that DC
Right.
has. Yes, we have five Flashes running around,
Right.
and you have so many Superboys running around now that coming in the spring here, they're doing a reign of the Superboys. And DC, oh, we can make this kind of sense. And he also introduced the concept of the emotional spectrum. Remember that?
Yep, yep, because you had fear, and all this stuff. So yeah, all the different colors, red is rage, and so on. No, I mean, again, he brought so much to that mythos, and what he proved really was that you don't have to burn the house down to do a decent reboot. And I think that's he basically did like a light reboot for the character without having to just do some kind of a crisis where everything is no, these characters are all dead and we're starting over, or whatever the gimmick of the day would be to make that happen. And he did it very seamlessly. It created the mythos, like the color spectrum that he did with Ethan, the emotional spectrum, like you said, in Darkest Night and all that stuff, because all the spectrum, the war between the colors, then that would create darkness. And so what Green Lantern has had in the character's entire history.
And we talk, I think it's really sloppy, lazy storytelling, corporate wise, and the writers when they just basically retcon and just rewrite things. It
Right.
just, one of the big, to me, one of the big flaws of New 52 is not having Clark and Lois being married. Reed and Sue have been married since the Silver Age, and they
Right.
really made that work. And then you had 20 years almost of Clark and Lois being no married together, and then they did some really great gymnastics to make that work after Rebirth. But now
Mhm.
Lois and Clark is like one of the core characters in the new
Mhm.
DC mythos. And Lois is so strong, and Clark is so strong, and Superman is so
Mhm.
strong. And that led to embracing the whole Superman family, which you hadn't had since the 90s. You have Supergirl, Connell, and all these other things. And then you go back to Marvel when they didn't know what to do with Peter Parker. So let's just say their marriage to Mary Jane never
Right.
happened.
Right.
And to me, that the character's never been the same since. You just
It's the tough thing to think because when you think of an audience, the comic books in general, the original idea of comics, right, is that it was for younger audiences. you come into a character like DC was always for a younger audience, and you mature into Marvel because of the subject matters and so on, and they go from there. But it was really a time period where you come into a comic, you read the series, the character, and then you grow up and you age out of it. But what happened was we all fell in love with the comics so much that it became a lifelong hobby or whatever you want to call it. So these characters really started to evolve with their audience, right? So as these younger kids were continuing to read comics and growing up and going to college and getting married and stuff, the characters started to follow that trend with the audience. Archie never leaves high school.
Right.
Bart Simpson never gets out of elementary school. So there's things that are just like South Park. Those kids will always be kids. And this is just more the comic book medium, specifically Marvel and DC. It's like they're the only ones that really have had these characters evolve to such a degree and mature up and so on. And there's pros and cons to both. Like when you think, let's say, for instance, like Superman, is the core canon of Superman better when he's got the alter ego of Clark Kent and Lois, who's like this really smart investigative reporter, and he's always playing that cat and mouse of the dual identity against with her and everyone else so that no one knows who his identity is? Or is canon best when the two of them are married and there's a family and there's this family dynamic, right? Like the Fantastic Four were built upon the idea of a family, right? Like they're married, the sister, the brother and sister, living all in the same building with Ben and so on. So that's to the core principle of that story. The idea of Peter was that same thing like in the original Superman, where it's like secret identity, right? He had Gwen Stacy, Gwen died, and now he had this other person. And like his daily life was always dealing with all the daily things that a normal person deals with as a young teenager. But is that story best, or is it better that he's married and potentially has kids and so on? And that's why I liked what they were doing with the most recent, like even Ultimate Spider-Man, in a sense that there wasn't like if you still wanted that older Spider-Man who was married with kids, there was a version of that for you, right? If you wanted that one where it's like the character is stuck in his moment in time of being a teenager with a Mary Jane or a young adult with Mary Jane and they're not married, etc., there's a story there for you. And I think that's what to your point of what with DC, there are these different flashes, there are these bigger family of characters now. So there's different appetite, whatever your appetite is for that type of character, there's something for you that you can buy into. But again, I think there's either neither one is right or wrong. I just think it's like, what is your core version of that character that you gravitate more towards?
They make that work, and I'm like, oh, that's some good stuff. Whereas we talked about being the core is really good in Green Lantern now. All that stuff that Johns did back here that they ignored for years, it's all part between the Green Lantern core and the core Green Lantern is there. They even made Carol Ferris into a much more three-dimensional character without ignoring her past, and now she's a hero. And I'm like, oh, maybe we'll have Carol and Hal finally get married after all these years. And I like to see. It's interesting now because Elongated Man is now alive again. So I mean, Sue Dibney is also alive again, which we're going off track because they died in Identity Crisis, and they haven't even really talked much about that. I think that this Green Lantern Johns, before I go off track, was a really nice story that still holds up decades later.
100%.
Still part of core of DC stuff, and it's a good example of what you can do when you're bringing back a character and honoring the past without giving the middle finger to readers about that character.
Yeah, it was a very good palate cleanser. That's how I look at it in that way. Like it was a way to honor the past, make logic of the past, and move the character forward. And so that again, we're not forgetting the things that he did, but we're giving justification for the reasoning why those things took place.
Before we wrap this up, do you have any closing thoughts before we wrap this up?
No, I just say I would definitely, for those that are interested in Green Lantern, definitely pick that book up and give it a read, give it a second read, and you'll see like that book really does hold up in that entire run. I know they did the omnibus versions of those books, and they are definitely worth picking up and reading all of Jeff's run because it was some of the best comic books of that time for sure.
Tom Marvelli, thank you so much for joining me. This has been a very fun talking about the Jeff Johns Green Lantern Rebirth. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.